Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Legal Saints. And today we take the opportunity to thank Mr. Vikas Pahwa, Senior Advocate, practicing in Delhi High Court and Supreme Court, for the gracious acceptance of the proposal to join us at the webinar for the topic Intricacies in the Extradition Laws. Mr. Vikas Pahwa is a third generation lawyer and he handles cases in criminal law pertaining to anti defection law, prevention of money laundering, and a lot to name. In 2008, he was appointed as Additional Standing Counsel for Delhi Police in the Delhi High Court. In 2009, he was appointed as Additional Standing Counsel for Central Bureau of Investigation in the Delhi High Court pertaining to matters like writ petitions. He has successfully prosecuted several cases, Maruti Suzuki Manesar factory riot case being one of them. He has certainly earned a niche in the Indian courts with regard to criminal litigation and corporate criminal litigation. So let's listen to him with gratitude in our hearts and curiosity in our minds.
Thank you. Lecture series on law and also legal saints. These are a bunch of youngsters who are doing a great job, and particularly Rubendra Ghuman, advocate, a very vibrant, energetic lawyer, and Gurpreet Sachdeva along with him, and Shubham Gaur and Trisha Parashar. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. And when I and Robbie is Rubendra were trying to discuss about the subject on which we can do the webinar, while we were talking, we just got an alert from UK that Mr. Vijay Mallya has lost his case in UK. So suddenly we realized that this is a topic which can be very relevant in the current facts and circumstances and the situation which we face. And considering the fact that a lot of accused from India are abroad, and many accused of foreign countries are in India, so this is one mutual exchange of accused which happens between two sovereign countries, and so therefore extradition starts, and the one country requests the other country, one jurisdiction requests the other jurisdiction to transfer the accused so that he can be punished in accordance with law. So extradition is something which is happening from the last over 150 years, I think. And I remember while I was reading a book on Savarkar recently, V.D. Savarkar, and there was a chapter which was attributed to him because the chapter was pertaining to his extradition proceedings, and he was extradited in 1909 or 1910, and for an offense which was committed in India. And at that point of time, the current Extradition Act was not there. Only an Indian Extradition Act 1903 and Fugitive Offenders Act were there, and many other acts of United Kingdom extradition acts were there. And there are four, in case would like to note down. The history is very important. Whenever we start discussing about a special law, the history of that special law is important to be discussed, because the history tells us how there is a progress and development in that act. So prior to independence, when a lot of our Indians were abroad and Britishers used to call them for an offense which is committed into India, they had their own extradition acts. Those are UK Extradition Act 1870 to 1932. So they kept on changing the law, but UK Extradition Act remains the same. And then Fugitive Offenders Act 1881 was there. And before partition, 1903. In 1903, the Extradition Act was constituted again. And thus, many cases, in case you Google, you will find prior to independence, the extradition was very easy because it was under the control of the Britishers. And now, if you see, the situation is just the reverse. And 1962, the act was enacted, and it was amended only once in 1993. And those amendments which have come in 1993 were very, very significant, and which I'll be discussing, with you in the next, say, about half an hour. It's very important for you to, get hold of the act to understand what extradition is all about. Now, as I told you, extradition is a request from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction for the purposes of returning the fugitive criminal to that state. So there is one requesting state and the other is a requested state. So, take for example, a person who has committed an offense in India and has traveled abroad. So, the extradition request will go from India, which will be a requesting state, to a place like UK, which will be a requested state. So, the relationship between India and UK becomes important. Before we start the discussion on the act, it is important to understand the difference between a treaty and an arrangement, because the entire act is divided into two parts. There are cases where there are binding treaties between two countries. They have entered into an arrangement. According to the Ministry of External Affairs website, there are at least 43 countries with which we have the treaties. Out of them, 37 are live. So these are agreements which happen between two countries. They sometimes expire due to a flux of time, sometimes they are not renewed. But as of now, there are 37 extradition treaties which are live, and there are about 8 arrangements which are alive. Total arrangements are 11, 3 of them have expired, so there are 8. So two sections. One section is pertaining to extradition where there is a treaty. Second section where there is an arrangement, but there is no treaty. So general difference between the two is that just like a oral agreement and a written agreement. So written agreement is equivalent to a treaty. Oral is like an arrangement. So written agreement is binding and oral agreement is not binding. And but still there can be a committee of nations where one nation respect the sentiment of the other and also the sovereignty of the other and tries to oblige without any extradition treaty to return the fugitive criminal. So our act deals with the cases where there are extradition treaties separately and also deals with the situation where there are only arrangements and there are no extradition treaties. So what is important before I start my talk on this entire subject? There are 4 or 5 things which one should understand and just keep a note of. One is a binding extradition treaty. It is defined under the act under section 2D. So please note down, we have to see before we start proceeding with a case for extradition, we must understand what is a treaty, whether it's binding or not. Second, what a person should understand is what is an extraditable offense, because a person can be returned to the requesting state only if it is an extraditable offense between two countries. Meaning what? Meaning that the crime should be common in both the countries. And in case there is a treaty, then that treaty should define what is an extraditable offense. Third is the doctrine of dual criminality. It is important for any proceedings of extradition that there should be a dual criminality. That means both the country should recognize that act as an offense. There are various cases where, like for instance, in drug cases in United States, there are various categories of contrabands, narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances which are banned, but they are not banned in India or vice versa. So if something which is not banned in India, which is not an offense in India, in that case, extradition cannot happen. So dual criminality is very, very important to know. And then fourth thing which is important to know is doctrine of speciality. What is doctrine of speciality? Doctrine of speciality actually indirectly has been defined in section 21 of the act, which says that the extradition can happen only in those offenses in which the proceedings have taken place. I'll give you a small example. Recently, I argued that matter in the court. if the requesting country has sent a fugitive to the requested country like India with certain terms and conditions that he is being extradited in these offenses, in these cases, then that particular fugitive criminal can be tried only in those offenses in which he or she has been extradited. There is an exception. Exception is if there is an offense which is made out from the facts of the case, which are less punishable than the offenses in which he has been extradited, that is also permitted. Or over and above, if the requesting state has consented for another offense for which he can be tried, even that is also permitted. So extraditable offense in which he has been extradited, anything less than that, or anything which is agreed by the requesting state. So this is doctrine of speciality. If this is violated, then the fugitive criminal has to be returned to the requested country. Now, there are various instances which I'll be discussing. I'll give you an instance of Abu Salim. I'll give you an instance of many other cases where additional offenses were added by the investigating agencies. But then ultimately the court said, sorry, this is not permissible in law. We have to respect the solemn undertaking which we have given. And doctrine of speciality says we can't proceed beyond that. So therefore, it is not permissible. Fourth is rule of non-inquiry. Now that's very interesting. The rule of non-inquiry is that if India has requested for extradition of an accused who is in UK, then UK government will not inquire into the mode and manner or method of the trial which happens in India and what is the procedure of trial. So the requested country will not inquire into the facts of the case and also the procedure involved. So therefore, there is no trial for finding out whether an offense has taken place or not. So non-inquiry of the alleged offense is one of the doctrine which is important, which one should know. And then there are general principles of international law, which we have to also understand. Then we should know the provisions of CRPC, and we should also note the constitutional protection which is given to an accused, and that is available even to a fugitive criminal. Article 21, 22, Article 14, etc. Everything is available to the fugitive criminal also. Now, if we have to understand how this entire trial takes place, we have to appreciate two situations. First is that this entire act, extradition act, deals with the trials which are happening in the country. This act doesn't deal with what happens outside in the foreign country. So therefore, the chapters which are involved here, the provisions of law which are involved here, are with regard to the provisions which have to be complied with when the fugitive criminal is brought to India, in the sense when he is being tried. Now, let us understand the chapters. So chapter 2 is very, very important. Chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4. These three chapters are very, very important. Now, chapter 2 deals with a situation where offense has taken place in India and the fugitive criminal is outside India. Now, suppose a crime, some economic offenses, crime has taken place in India, just like a bank fraud. I'm not nominating anyone. Let's not go into those facts. I'm just going to generalize everything, and we'll not go specific to a case because all those cases are live and they are, sub judice. So it's not appropriate for us to deal with them or give any opinion on them. But let us take a hypothetical case of a bank fraud committed in India, accused in, say, United States of America, USA. So if you see, India and USA has a treaty. So when India and USA has a treaty, there is a binding agreement between the countries and everything is written. The procedure is given in the treaty. So what we need to see is the provisions in the act. We have to see the treaty and we have to see the general principles of international law. So when we see the act and India wants to call that, accused to India, the investigating agency, which is investigating the offense, They will send a request to that state, requested state, that this is an accused. We have conducted our investigation. This is the report which we have prepared. This is the material which we have collected, and the investigation report is ready. We have satisfied ourselves that he has committed the crime. Kindly send him back. So this has to go through a diplomatic channel. And the Ministry of External Affairs is the ministry which deals with this situation. And the investigating agency, CBI, ED, or the local police, they will prepare a report, send it to them. But while doing all this, they can get a non-bailable warrant against that person. They have to get an open-ended warrant, because if you give a date of the warrant, then the date can expire. So it has to be an open-ended warrant. Matter is examined by the Ministry of External Affairs. File is sent through diplomatic channel from Ministry of External Affairs to Ministry of External Affairs of USA. They examine and they appoint a magistrate or a court which will deal with the matter, and then we hand over everything to them. So this act does not deal with that situation. This act deals with the situation only till the request is made. After that, the law of that country will prevail. There is a trial which happens in that country, where, of course, they will see whether it's a fit case for extradition or not. Nowadays, the pleas normally which are taken by the fugitive criminal is with regard to the inhuman, conditions of jail in India. So human rights violations and many other, UN conventions which we have are highlighted in the court and saying that please don't send us there. It is unsafe for us. I think today itself we read in the newspaper that with regard to 1993 bomb blast accused, although we had the Indian government had sent the extradition request long time back, and that fugitive criminal tried in every court, lost in every court, but ultimately a minister comes up and says, sorry, we are not doing it, we are cancelling the extradition request. So our request, Indian government request, has been rejected by that government, that's UK government. So when India's fugitive criminal goes abroad, then the law of the other country will apply. If that country allows, then that country will pass a proper order, and an opportunity of appeal will be given to that person, who will obviously, from the court of a magistrate to high court and then the Supreme Court, he has legal remedies available. If finally he loses, then the person is extradited, he's brought back, and then he is tried in India for the offense which he has committed in India. Now, when he comes back, the only obligation which the Indian court has is to comply with Section 21, doctrine of speciality, as I had discussed with you, that the government should take care, the courts should assure that the accused who's brought from abroad is tried only in those offenses in which he has been extradited, or minor offenses, or offenses in which there was an order or consent was given by the court. Now, this is with regard to offenses which have been committed in India and fugitive from India has gone abroad. So let's leave this now and now come to the main. Now we have to now deal with this act. How this act comes into the picture is when a fugitive criminal of some other country lands in India. There are multiple cases. If you Google, you go to the Supreme Court website, you will find multiple cases. Now, this is what we are discussing now. This is the most important aspect. When the fugitive criminal of another country, after committing the offense, comes to India, how he has to be dealt with. Now, the extradition requests are sent by those countries to Indian countries, to India, to the Indian government. And Indian government has to deal with it. So let's take, for example, Chapter 2, which deals with the cases where there are treaties available between the two countries. So when there is a treaty, then of course the terms and conditions are already settled. The agreement is already there. How the inquiry has to take place, what kind of documents have to be filed is already spelled out, and therefore the Indian authorities have to see as to what are the terms and conditions, and then they start examining. So when the Ministry of External Affairs receives a request from abroad, that requisition is examined. That requisition for surrender comes in Section 4. So in Section 4 of Indian Extradition Act 1962, request is made by a foreign state to the Indian government to return a fugitive. That is examined, and it has to be accompanied by some important documents to show as to what is the offense, dual criminality, the charge sheet, if any, or investigation report, affidavits of the investigating officer or an expert on which the requesting country relies upon. All that is sent to the Indian government. Indian government analyzes it under Section 4 and 5, then send the matter to a magistrate. In Delhi, we have ACMM's court, which deals with these kind of requests. So everything is sent to a learned magistrate. The magistrate applies his mind, looks at the document, and has the power to issue warrants. So if the accused is within the territory of India, warrants are issued so that he can be brought to the court and dealt with in accordance with law. This is chapter 2. And once the accused is arrested, brought before the court, then we have the provisions of bail, just like we have in CRPC. Provision of bails will apply. And in case it's not a very, very heinous offense, bails are granted very, easily in these cases. And once bail is granted, then the proceeding starts, the inquiry starts. Now, what is the nature of this inquiry? The nature of this inquiry is only to ascertain whether it is an extraditable case or not within the framework of the treaty, within the framework of the act and the general principles. The magistrate has to be careful not to dwell into the facts of the case and to see whether the offense is correct, procedure has been followed, documents which have been filed are prima facie, admissible in evidence or not. So all that inquiry is done, and then ultimately an order is passed by the court that yes, this is a case, I'm satisfied, and then this is a case where he should be extradited. Now, some legal intricacies which come from this particular procedure, I can share it with you right now. Number one is, what is the nature of trial which happens? What is the kind of satisfaction which a magistrate has to show? The law is very clear on this, that the magistrate is not required to apply his mind and see whether offense is made beyond reasonable doubt, just like he has to do it in the other cases. The test is equivalent to a test of jurisdiction of a magistrate or a sessions court when they are framing charges in a case. So at the stage of framing of charge, the court has to see whether there is a grave suspicion against the accused or not. If there's a grave suspicion, then charges are framed. So same test applies at this stage. First proposition. Second proposition, when this exercise is being done, what is the nature of evidence which has to be evaluated? The documents which are filed by the requesting state. So there are few judgments which deal with this aspect, which says that it's not necessary for a magistrate to see that the Evidence Act is satisfied, particularly Section 3. Section 3 deals with oral and documentary evidence. So the court has to see only prima facie. Court is not required to see that every document which is submitted by a requesting state should be a document in terms of the Indian Evidence Act, and whether the provision of Section 207, 208, 91 apply or not is also a question mark. But there are few judgments which says that 208, 207 doesn't apply. I myself, I'm doing few cases where I have no option except to apply to the court and request that the requesting state has deliberately concealed the material facts and has also filed false statement, false affidavit before the court. Please take action. So in my case, because it's a live case, so I don't want to nominate the case, but just tell you the proposition that sometimes out of exuberance, the requesting states deliberately do not furnish complete information to the foreign state. In my case, which I am handling, where they deliberately conceal 70% of the information pertaining to the jury trial, Give only 30% of the information to the court, because that 70% is against that state. Give the 30% and send it to India. India evaluates the position and prima facie finds that yes, it's a case where he should be extradited. But when he's represented, his lawyer goes to the court and informs that look, this 70%, there 7 out of 10 documents have not been sent by them. This is the injustice which I was being faced in that country. They have deliberately not shown it to you. The affidavits that they have filed are also false. They are giving wrong information. Will Section 91 apply? This is a very, very interesting proposition of law. Applications are filed, the court has issued notice, and court has told the Union of India, please tell your counterpart to supply documents, because these are documents which can actually change the entire complexion of the case. So please supply. The reply from the requesting state is, we don't want to file anything else. You decide whatever you decide with these 30% of documents. Only 3 documents out of 10 are more than enough. We don't want to give anything else. So see the intricacy, see how the entire case can collapse and how this case can actually prejudice the accused if this kind of concealment of information happens. Now, coming back on the procedure, that accused, the fugitive criminal normally can't say, file the document and say, give me more documents. And file an application and say, these are documents which are more important. This is happening in that court abroad, and send me these documents. So normally court doesn't involve itself unless and until it's a case where the gross misjustice has been done. Now, in my case, which I was referring to, a great injustice was done. So therefore the court, gave some leverage to us. So once this exercise is done, the extradition inquiry is completed. The court comes to the conclusion that yes, it's a case where the fugitive criminal should be extradited. A request is made and a final order is passed. Order is sent to the government, then government takes a call. Government can reject even after that, but normally they accept. And the fugitive criminal has the right to challenge this in the High Court and then in the Supreme Court in case he wants to. So this is an elaborate procedure where there's an extradition treaty. So section 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. So 4 to 11 sections which are in chapter 2 deals with the situation where there's an extradition treaty. Now the next chapter is a chapter where there's an arrangement. Now arrangement, as I told you, is like an oral agreement. There is no treaty, but there is a mutual respect. They may decide, or they may ultimately issue a notification under section 12. You will see this, in the coming many months, this kind of argument will happen, because there are people at various places where there are no treaties. So that proposition of law has to be decided in the court. But all those cases where there is no treaty, they fall in chapter 3 of the Extradition Act 1962. There's an elaborate procedure which happens that if there is no treaty, then you have to get the warrants issued, get them arrested, but there is no proper inquiry. The only section which deals with an inquiry in that condition is section 70, which is not all that elaborate. Why it is not elaborate? Because there is no treaty. So if there was a treaty, then obviously there would have been a proper elaborate procedure which is mentioned in the treaty. But since there is no treaty, so there is no. So in those cases where there is no treaties, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, these are the sections which are relevant. Now coming back on the 4th and the relevant chapter, treaty, arrangement. Now 4 is the chapter which deals when the crime is committed in India. Crime is committed in India. Now we want the fugitive criminal to come back to India and face the trial. There are only 3 or 4 provisions there. Section 19, 20, 21 are important. And the most important, as I told you earlier, with regard to doctrine or speciality, is section 21. 21 says that if an accused or a convicted person is brought back for the purpose of investigation or trial, then he has to be tried only in those cases which are extraditable or less than that offense, or where they have agreed. Now, this is a very sacrosanct doctrine which has to be, complied with it. So 21, one has to read very, very carefully because it's very important. And then next chapter, chapter 5, is the miscellaneous chapter. Now, this miscellaneous chapter deals with the, uh, you know, conditions like release on bail, discharge, how the warrants are issued. Now, there may be a case where an accused is arrested. I remember a case which I did long time back. That was, I think, in 2001, about 19 years back. I did a case. Now, just I'm just deviating from this chapter and quoting an instance which is very interesting for you all to know that crime committed abroad, accused is has come to India, and he's arrested. Now the question is, there is no extradition request. In that case is now concluded, so I'm discussing it with you. Uh, a person who's come from Singapore after committing a crime came to India and was roaming around in India. So the bank, who was a complainant in Singapore, engaged a detective, a private detective, because sometimes the countries know that you will file an extradition request, the person will leave the country, go to some other country. So in this case, a private detective was engaged for the purposes of finding out where the fugitive criminal is. Instead of finding only, he found the accused and also arrested him and called the police. The police is called, and this private detective says, "I have arrested him because he's the one who's wanted in Singapore." Now, the interesting proposition of law was, a person who's wanted abroad, but there is no extradition request, there is no warrant from that country, can he be apprehended? It was challenged in the court. And the plea which is taken by the bank was that even private people can arrest the accused person. There is a power in CRPC. Section 43 of the CRPC says a private person can also arrest an accused who has committed the crime. And section 41(1)(g) says if a person who's committed the crime outside the jurisdiction of the country can also be arrested. So these two powers are used. He's arrested and he's put behind bars. In the meantime, the extradition request came and the trial started, and the bail was refused. And within no time, I think this was in 2001, he was extradited. It's a reported judgment. So a very interesting proposition of arrest without extradition proceedings. That means initiation of process without extradition proceedings. Now, coming back on this chapter 4, there is a power of arrest here, that he can be arrested. And very interesting proposition which one should note is that there is a provision of provisional arrest. There is a section which deals with provisional arrest. That formal request has not come, but you have found the accused or the fugitive, and because of the warrant, he is arrested. And then what to do with him? If there is no request which comes from the foreign state, will he languish in jail for the rest of his life? No, the Act deals with that situation. And Section 34B says, in the case of provisional arrest, the time given for the purposes of his detention is only 60 days. In 60 days, the process should be completed, and the extradition process should start, at least, so that it goes to the court, and proper documents should reach the country so that the proceedings start. That's the provision with regard to provisional arrest. And also a situation where the person who's going out of India, also there is a condition that he should be tried only in the extraditable offenses, or offenses less than extraditable offenses in punishment, or where there is an agreement. That is section number 31. So 21 is with regard to people, those who are coming from the foreign state. 31 is for the people who are going out of India to a foreign state. Protection is given to both of them. So these are some important provisions of law in the Act, and it's a very detailed Act. We can actually go on talking about it, but I don't mind taking the questions, or I can speak few more minutes on the powers of the Interpol, which are interconnected. Very often we see that in India, when a person goes out and he has to be extradited, the first thing to make him stationary or to confine him to one country is to get a red corner notice. So Interpol is the authority. It's an international police organization where there are 188 countries who are the members of international police organization. They help and aid in making sure that they don't travel. So once a red corner notice is issued, it is circulated with the immigration, and people can't travel. That's the first step actually, which takes place in the investigation to stall and to find out where the accused is. At that point of time, he's not a fugitive criminal because the investigation is pending. He's only an accused. So those are the time when there's only an accused, and red corner notice is issued. There are also cases with regard to deportation. Now, one is extradition, where there is either an extradition treaty or an arrangement, or there are cases where accused are deported. Now, what is deportation? Deportation is where there is no treaty and the person concerned is directed to leave the country. I think it has happened recently in United Arab Emirates, UAE, where people are apprehended and they are deported without any trial, without any inquiry. That is also possible. Those are although UAE has an extradition treaty with India, but deportation is also possible. And then there is something called exclusion. You are excluded from entering into our country. That exclusion orders are also passed. So extradition, deportation, and exclusion. These are three things which one has to understand when you are dealing with, the provisions of the extradition. And of course, in case you want to understand what are the cases in which the fugitive criminals are not returned. So there are, in general, we all know that cases where the offenses are, political in nature, where the extradition is sought for purpose other than the criminal trial. Those are the instances which are also given. In fact, in every treaty they are given, and even in this act, if in case you would like to note down, there's a provision of discharge of the accused. That is section number 29. So section 29 is important, where the Indian government or any of the government can, reject the extradition request in case it is of political nature. So there are 4 or 5 instances which are mentioned here, where Indian government, only central government. So it says power of central government to discharge any fugitive criminals. So first is in case the offense is very minor in nature, trivial in nature, or the request is not made in good faith, or the return is for a political reason, or it is unjust and inexpedient to surrender or return the fugitive criminal, then the government may order to discharge the accused. I'll just share one instance with you now. I've just did a case recently. Since it is concluded again, I can share it with you. It's a reported judgment. I appeared for a lady who's a French lady, and she was arrested at the Indian-Nepal border. And because of the non-bailable warrants which were issued against her from Chile, and also red corner notice. So she's traveling in various parts of the world. She traveled to Germany first, got arrested because of the red corner notice. Trial happens, she is discharged, goes back to France, then again starts her travel because she thinks that now she can travel because she's won the extradition trial. She comes to India via Nepal border, arrested at Nepal, and then handed over to the Indian government. Indian government arrests that lady, brings her to India, to Delhi, and the extradition proceeding starts. Inform the Chilean government saying that this is a lady, there's a red corner notice, she has come to India, and there's the note with the red corner notice suggests that there's a case which is pending in your country. Please tell us what to do. And she's taken into custody. We challenge her custody, saying that how can you arrest someone when there is no requisition of extradition, and all those provisions of law. The challenge is made, challenge goes to the court, and it is ultimately held that yes, the arrest was not proper. But then now the Chilean government has come, and Chilean government has made a requisition, So therefore, she has to be extradited. Magistrate has been appointed. The trial will happen. Now, what happens is, in the meantime, when the entire documents are being scrutinized, we learn that there is no extradition treaty between India and Chile. So therefore, which chapter will apply? Whether it will chapter number 3 or chapter number 2. So when this argument is raised in the court, then the Chilean government, the council for the Chilean government, and also central government, they come up with a treaty which was signed in 1800 something. It was signed in 1886. It was signed between the UK government and the Chile government, which was subsisting, not ratified in the Extradition Act. But there was a note which was brought by the government, which says that in 1960, I think 62 odd, during the debate in the parliament, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru gave the list of the countries with which there was an extradition treaty, and Chile was mentioned in that list. And now, in 2015, when this incident happened, the Indian government issues a notification under Section 3, says that we notify Chile as a country with which we have an extradition. So therefore, all this was placed before the Honorable Supreme Court. And Supreme Court ultimately held against her, saying that no, it's a valid treaty. If two sovereign nation, two state decide to extradite someone, then we will not intervene. The judiciary should not interfere. It's an executive job. They should do it. So ultimately, the Supreme Court said that it's a valid treaty. So therefore, there will be a trial in the court of the special judge or a magistrate. Now, what happens thereafter? Why I mentioned this is because I was referring it to section number 29, power of central government to discharge any fugitive criminal. In spite of all this, in spite of holding that there's an extradition treaty, in spite of saying that it may be a prima facie offense for which the trial is required, inquiry is required, Indian government discharged her of the extradition request, dismissed the extradition request, and sent her back to her own home country under the provision of Section 29. This may be a diplomatic, decision between the two countries, not a judicial or an executive, but a diplomatic. But in spite of all that, she has been sent back. Maybe because ultimately it was prima facie established diplomatically. There may be a political offense. She may not be involved in that case. So see how it works. The level and the jurisdiction of inquiry is very limited. The court cannot go into the facts of the case. The only objective is to find whether there should be an extradition or not, and then the orders are passed and they are complied with it. Very seldom the requests of extradition are rejected. Mostly they are allowed unless and until they are of some political nature where it is rejected. I mentioned you one. I mentioned this case to you, which is also reported in case somebody wants to read. This is Mary Emmanuel Verhoeven. This is a case of 2016, volume 6, SCC 456. It's a very interesting reading with regard to the applicability of treaties and how treaties are made and how the arrangements are made, how the treaties are ratified, because it's a very, very old treaty which was mentioned here, which was ratified. So therefore, this is a very important judgment for you to read. Another judgment with regard to the same applicability and notification of one old treaty with a new treaty is a judgment of State of West Bengal versus Jugal Kishore More, 1969 1 SCC page 440. 1969 SCC volume 1 page 4. These two judgments are an interesting reading. Anybody who wants to understand how the treaties are prepared and how they are ratified or notified along in terms of the Indian Extradition Act. One more judgment which I would like to refer for your reading is the case of Abu Salim. Now, Abu Salim was extradited from I think Portugal, after a prolonged litigation in that country. And ultimately, a detailed order was passed in which all the cases in which he was to be tried were mentioned, and the comprehensive order is passed. And when he's brought back and he's tried, there was an element of including some additional sections. As I told you, in terms of Section 21, doctrine of speciality, additional sections cannot be added, particularly if they are more serious than the extraditable offense. Abu Salim case is reported in 2011, volume 11, SCC 214. This is also a very, very interesting judgment to read. And another judgment which I would like you to read is Sarabjit Rik Singh versus Union of India. This will explain it to you what should be the scope of inquiry when the extradition request is being examined by a magistrate. 2008, volume 2, SCC 417. So these are 3 or 4, 5 judgments which are important, which you can read to understand how the extradition works. And of course, this Extradition Act is a very specialized act, and there are not many cases in the country. There are very few cases. There are some people who specialize only in this, but it's a very interesting field. And of course, there'll be an influx of some more people in the country, and this law certainly will grow in the next few years. So, Rabendra, should I continue, or do you want to ask questions?
Sir. Hello, dear viewers. Welcome all. First of all, let me thank Mr. Vikas Pahwa, the senior advocate. Sir, sorry there was a connectivity lag due to which we could not welcome you. Please give me the honor of welcoming you in a short note, sir. To all our viewers, Mr. Vikas Pahwa is an internationally renowned lawyer. Mr. Vikas Pahwa's senior advocate is a third-generation lawyer practicing in Supreme Court and Delhi High Court. He was designated as a senior advocate in July 2011. He has a long experience in litigation practice and has advised clients on diverse matters relating to criminal law, commercial law, corporate law, constitutional law, family law, and other general laws. He has done many cases in India and abroad. To be noted, he is amongst the few of the lawyers who have done matters in India as well as abroad. In his 27 years of active practice, he has done many cases involving complicated questions of law. He has handled cases of criminal law like anti-corruption, prevention of money laundering, NDPS, FERA, Secrets Act, Coffee Posa, National Security Act, UOPA, etc. He represents corporation, banks, financial institutions, insurance companies, and individuals before various courts, tribunals, and forums. In January 2008, he was appointed as an additional standing counsel criminal in Delhi High Court and represented Delhi Police in various matters pertaining to bails, quashing of FIR, appeal, etc. In Jan 2009, he was appointed as standing counsel for CBI. He resigned from both the posts upon his designation as a senior advocate on 5/8/2011. And ever since, he is in private practice, appearing all over the country in various courts, primarily on criminal side. Few among many of his noted cases include Maruti Suzuki India Limited Manesar Factory Royd case, in which general manager HR of the company was burnt alive, and 90 employees of Maruti Suzuki were severely injured. Mr. Vikas Pahwa appeared for Maruti Suzuki Limited before the trial court. The trial court took mammoth 4.5 years to be concluded, in which 148 accused were prosecuted. The trial court, it's noteworthy mentioning over here that the trial court convicted 31 accused to prison. Out of 31 accused, 13 were awarded life imprisonment. This is the caliber of Mr. Pahwa. Mr. Pahwa is also appearing pro bono for Association for Victims of Upahar Tragedy in which 59 people died due to fire in a cinema hall in 1997. After a prolonged trial, the accused persons were convicted by trial court for culpable homicide not amounting to murder, punishable under Section 304 of IPC, and criminal negligence under Section 304A of IPC. This judgment was upheld in the Supreme Court as well as the Delhi High Court. Mr. Pawar is also appearing pro bono for SC for victims in case of Meerut fire tragedy. Mr. Pawar has earned a nick in Indian courts with regard to criminal and corporate litigation. He is considered as one of the leading counsels among contemporary lawyers on the criminal side. He is representing Dr. Shashi Tharoor in criminal trial case pending in the Court of Special Judge, Rouse Avenue Court, New Delhi, regarding the death of his late wife, Srimati Sunanda Tharoor Pushkar, alleging the offense of cruelty and abetment to suicide. In 2000, sorry, in 2015, he conducted a felony trial along with the local Greek lawyers before three members bench of Court of Appeal in Athens, Greece, on behalf of a client of Indian origin. He was permanent part of the team of lawyers from Greece, Oman, and India. The client was acquitted with all criminal charges. In March 2017, he appeared with a team of Greek lawyers in Supreme Court of Greece to oppose the motion to vacate filed by the prosecutor against order of acquittal. The said appeal was again dismissed in July 2017. Mr. Vikas Pawar has appeared before the Court of Dubai International Financial Center, headed by Justice David Steele in Dubai, to defend a client of his of Indian origin. He is also empaneled by the DLSA, Delhi's Legal Services Authority, as senior counsel for appearing in legal aid cases in Delhi High Court, and also empaneled by National Legal Authority as senior counsel for appearing in legal aid cases in the Supreme Court of India. Mr. Pawar did an advanced course in international criminal law in the Hugh Academy of International Law at Hugh in November 2018. So here we have a speaker who is not only just a well-known, renowned lawyer of the country, but internationally renowned and having a vast experience. His portfolio itself is showing that not only is he doing matters in various courts across the country, but has also been doing it internationally, like in Greece, Dubai, etc. So may I ask a few questions, sir, from my end, sir?
Yeah, please.
So the first question is, where does India stand in terms of judicial interference, the matters relating to extradition cases?
I in fact discussed that normally the interference with the courts are very limited unless and until the cases are of political nature and there's a real lacuna in the documents which are filed. Otherwise, normally, because it's an executive exercise of power, so courts are very reluctant to interfere. So, but just like red corner notices can be challenged in writ jurisdiction, the law is very clear. The order which is passed by the magistrate in terms of an inquiry under Chapter 2, that can be separately challenged. But what I have seen is normally the courts do not interfere unless and until there's a gross miscarriage of justice to the fugitive criminal.
So my next question is, what do you think? There are delays in allowing extradition requests despite so many treaties arrangement between countries, sir.
Yes, of course, you're right. There are gross delays, and if you see the extradition case which I am doing, there's a case of I think 2003, which I'm doing, which is still pending, where of course there's a very interesting proposition which is involved, which shows that even the Indian courts and government are not inclined. It's a case of a young boy who met with an accident in New York. He was a student who was studying there. He went there, met with an accident, and in that accident, the driver of the other car died, and there was no criminal case. So he came back. Once he came back, a jury trial started in New York, where it was found that allegedly, he jumped the red light. So jumping the red light resulting into an accident in US is a manslaughter of second degree. But in India, it is 304A, which is punishable for 2 years. So see the distinction. Manslaughter second degree is punishable for 14 years. 304A is for 2 years. So this dual criminality has a massive difference of sentence, which shows the reluctance. And that reluctance has resulted into delay of the trial in this case. Because even if he's sent to US, he will face a sentence which we can't even dream of in our country for jumping a light and meeting with an accident. But normally, as you say, if you see the instances abroad in UK and USA, there are multiple levels of appeals which are allowed to a fugitive. And very often we see that at least 4 to 5 years time is taken for the purposes of extraditing an accused. Maybe because they have to make sure that he is properly heard, principle of natural justice is complied with, all the UN conventions are followed. Is a very exhaustive procedure for the purposes of sending somebody to the country. So normally it takes time, but it doesn't take too long. But yes, 3-4 years is what we have seen in all these cases which has happened.
So asking extempore, sir, picking up the lead from what you have said right now, sir. Sir, difference of sentences qua the countries, sir. For example,
Yes.
India and America, sir. For example, like you've rightly said, there is a vast difference between sections and quantum of punishment, sir. So, does this in any manner come in the way of extradition while when the courts deal with fugitive requests, sir?
Yes, it does. It does. This is the plea which the accused has, this fugitive has taken in the court, saying there is a massive difference, between the sentence, and there is an option. If you see the act, there is an option of rejecting the extradition request and trying that accused in our own country. So the offer which he has given is, you try me here for 304A in case I have committed the offense. But why should a person be put to jeopardy, particularly of a huge sentence, just because there's a massive difference? So he says, although this crime has to be established, the problem in extradition is you can't go into the facts. But these are not facts. These are two legal positions where there's a massive sentence difference. It plays a very important role. It affects Article 21 and the constitutional protection given to an accused. Therefore, it will play a very important role. But he should give an option of being tried in this country.
So, what is the role that conventions and declarations have in what you have said, sir? Could you expand it with the treaties that each country has to each other, sir?
Yeah, of course, these treaties, as I said in the beginning, are these solemn and sacrosanct documents. They have to be
So,
taken into consideration at the time of extradition, but nothing is beyond the act. The most important is the act. That's what the Honorable Supreme Court has said recently in the case of Maddie, that the act has to be taken into consideration, because these are the checks and balances and the procedure of law which have been enunciated in the act. They have to be followed. Treaty, of course, treaty expands the procedure and also explains what are the circumstances in which the extradition can happen, what is an extraditable offense, whether it is defined or not. So treaties and conventions play a very important role in extradition proceeding, but the most important thing is the act.
so coming on again, picking up a cue, sir, from what you have said, so Article 21 says right to a fair trial. Now, so as you have
Yes.
said, sir, and your vast domain, sir, of international practice, could you suggest, sir, that sir, I'm sorry, sir. Sir, could you suggest that the courts are not allowed to go into the merits of the facts, sir? Where does an application of judicial mind come, sir? Then,
No, as I said earlier, that extradition proceedings are only to prima facie come to a conclusion whether the person should be extradited or not. They don't go into the facts of the case. The requested country cannot inquire into that offense. That offense is totally different. So they have to see whether there is a treaty or not. They have to see whether it's an extraditable case or not. They have to make sure that that's not a politically motivated case. It is not a political offense. So in the end, if you see the Extradition Act, there is a schedule which is attached. Those schedules gives offenses which will not be considered to be an offense, which is political in nature. And if you see all those important heinous offenses of Anti-Hijacking Act, Suppression of Unlawful Activities Act, Safety and Civil Aviation Act, International Convention, Culpable Homicide, Murder, and explosive substance, these are all offenses. In case they are committed, then extradition becomes easy. The fugitive criminal cannot take a plea that it is politically motivated. So therefore, the requested court does not go into the merits of the case. It's very clear. The law is very, very clear. There can't be a proper trial. The trial is only to prima facie come to a conclusion whether offenses has taken place or not. And that's why during my address, I said it is akin to the jurisdiction of a court when the charges are framed. When the charges are framed, the court only says whether there is a grave suspicion against the accused or not. Same logic will apply here. Supreme Court has said time and again that that you can't go beyond that. You can't even ask for the documents to be exhibited the way they are exhibited in the Indian Evidence Act. All this is clear, and in fact, I can give a judgment on this point in case your viewers would like to note down. There is a judgment with regard to the exhibition of document, whether document should be. I think I have already shared the judgment of Sarabjit Rig Singh versus Union of India. It gives you the entire, law on the procedure. What should be the test for exhibiting of document? Because here the documents are not filed. Only the affidavits of the requesting state is filed. So affidavits are filed, the proposition of law is filed, and some statements are filed with regard to an expert. So those are all documents which will only establish prima facie offense, not the offense beyond reasonable doubt.
Moving on to next question, sir. What are the rights available to fugitives when they are extradited to the requesting nation such as India, sir?
Such as India. So in case he comes back to India, so in case he's returned to India, Section 21 is the protection which is given to the fugitive criminal who's brought back to India. And recently there was a case of, I'm not nominating him. He was brought back from England, and a police custody remand was taken for the purpose of further investigation. We challenged by saying that how can there be further investigation when the investigation is already concluded, and more offenses cannot be added, because that is the undertaking, solemn undertaking which you have given to a foreign court already. So court upheld that argument, and Section 21 very specifically says doctrine of speciality. He can only be tried for the offenses in which he has been extradited or anything less than that. And there are provisions of bail, just like we have provision of bail, in CRPC. CRPC's provisions are applicable here. So he will be treated like any other accused. He will be granted bail if he is not required for investigation or during the course of trial to be in custody. And the trial will happen just like any other case. He will have all protection of an accused, which are available to an ordinary accused in the country.
So coming on to a main question, sir, the very moot question and a very important question, sir. This is a random question, sir, after having a pick from your talk, sir. So India has been asking for the custody of Dawood Ibrahim and his aides. And Pakistan, Dubai, sir, have been reluctant, or in one manner or the other been evasive in giving a positive reply. Today I was just reading the newspaper, sir. I guess even London has refused, sir, to give the custody of Dawood and aides, sir. So I think we are a signatory with the UK, sir. So in such a situation, what do you think is a remedy, sir?
Look, I have also read in the newspaper, and what I have read is that although the Indian request is with regard to the 1993 bomb blast, and the extradition request was examined by the courts, and the courts have passed order in favor of the Indian government, and ultimately it's a bureaucratic decision which has been taken as far as this case is concerned, and the extradition request has been rejected by the officer of the government, not by the court. although the
So,
court has allowed extradition, but an executive decision has been taken by the government and the extradition has been rejected. This was the news which we read in the newspaper. Of course, we can't blame the courts for this. We can't blame the government for this because we have taken the initiative. The government has taken the initiative, filed a request, went to the UK court, contested the proceedings, got an order in the favor, and ultimately, just like we have that Section 29, which I mentioned to you, where this French lady was returned back to France rather than to Chile. Same power has been used by the UK government, and the extradition request has been rejected politically.
so very well answered, sir. So coming on to my next question, so how do you actually defend fugitives in India where there's an extradition request from other countries, sir?
Sorry, come again. I missed your question. I'm so sorry.
So how do you actually defend fugitives in India where there is an extradition request from other countries, sir?
Yes, of course, if the request has come from abroad and he is found here, as I told you, he has all legal rights available. And we have done few cases where protection has been given. One instance is with regard to the difference in punishment, which we have just discussed. Second is with regard to false affidavits filed by the diplomatic officers, by the diplomats, which we have challenged, where there's a concealment of information, there's a suppression of facts, and also the material, where the courts have taken things very, very seriously. So these are all, as I told you, the pleas are available in the Act. In case those pleas are agitated in the trial court in the right perspective, the extradition request can also be rejected. But in heinous offenses, I've seen it's very, very difficult because the courts are reluctant to go into the facts of the case. And if the proper request is made along with documents in terms of the treaty, then it's very easy for a requesting state to get an order from the court.
Right, sir. So I put you my next question, sir. Can extradition take place in absence of extradition treaty, and how?
Yes, yes.
And so, if yes, how much that would be tenable in the eyes of law?
I told you there is a chapter which is available in the Act which deals with the situation where there is no treaty. So chapter 3 deals with a situation where there are only arrangements, and arrangements are not binding. But there, of course, sometimes, it happens. I remember reading a case of 1969 Supreme Court where there was the matter was pertaining to Hong Kong, and the accused was supposed to be sent back to Hong Kong. The warrants were issued. The Honorable Supreme Court has held that because this person challenged by saying that there is no treaty between India and Hong Kong. So one paragraph of that judgment is very, very pertinent, where the court says that normally the courts should not intervene in these executive actions between two sovereign countries, even if there is no extradition treaty or there is no extradition treatment. If both the foreign countries are ready, if they are ready and willing to send the fugitive, the court will not intervene. So even without arrangement, even without trial, sometimes just like deportation from UAE, the person is sent to India, now he's facing the trial. So two countries have decided to send the person from one place to the other. I don't think any court will intervene into that. So it does happen. And when it happens, it can be challenged. There are people who have challenged it, but challenge were not successful because the court says we can't go into all this. Since the accused has already come, the detainee has been sent, so therefore now he has to face the trial. So it's between two countries. If two countries decide, the court will not intervene.
Got it, sir. So courts restrain and accept the sovereignty of nations, sir.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So coming on to my next question, sir, can somebody be arrested in the requested state before the receipt of formal request of extradition request from the requesting country, and how the same is dealt with the court of law, sir?
Yes, it is possible that sometimes the accused are arrested provisionally and the formal request follows. It can happen when there's a red corner notice and the fugitive is in India and he's traveling. Because of the red corner notice, he can be arrested. When he's arrested, then the requesting state is informed. that the person has already been arrested. Please tell us what to do. If the request comes in time within 60 days, then it is fine. Otherwise, he can be discharged. Section 34B is very clear in that.
Right, sir. So, what is the relevance of dual criminality or or double criminality in extradition cases? Do you have any experience in this regard, sir? You being an ace lawyer, having done matters abroad and in India as well as abroad.
Well, it happens. There are cases where I think in NDPS there are some cases, because if you see dealing in drugs, we have a schedule in the NDPS Act where there are a number of drugs which are mentioned. Drugs which are outside the purview of the schedule are not the drugs which are violative. The possession of which will not be a crime as far as India is concerned. It may be a crime in any other country. So if somebody is found to be dealing with a contraband or a substance which is banned in that country, in the requesting country, but he comes into India and is arrested because of a non-bailable warrant, he can challenge this by saying that, sorry, it is not criminal in India. So why should I go there? So dual criminality is very, very important. It should be extraditable and both should be an offense. For instance, I'll give you an example of 498A. In 498A case, so 498A, demand of dowry, etc., offenses in India. But when we have cases where people have traveled to US and the women, the wives have filed cases in India and red corner notices are issued, there are judgment which says that 498 is not an offense in US. So US will not extradite you because 498 is only an offense here. So dual criminality means in both the countries, it should be a penal offense.
Correct, sir. I mean, I believe, sir, UK and in US also, these marriage offences are more of a civil wrong than of a criminal wrong, like that of India, sir. So coming to the next question.
Yeah.
So what is the relevance of doctrine of speciality in cases of the in cases where the fugitive is returned by the requested state for a detailed order?
Yeah, doctrine of speciality is covered in Section 21. Which says that the extraditable offense, if it is mentioned in the order, then he can be tried only in that offense or an offense which is less punishable than that. Or third category is offenses where both the countries have agreed. So that is doctrine of speciality, which is mentioned in Section 21 and 31 of the Act.
Right, sir. So coming on to the next question, sir. How red corner notices are issued by police in India? We see in every case where an accused is not available, red corner notices are issued by the police, sir, in a random manner.
That is correct. It happens very often in our country that whenever an accused goes abroad, the investigating agencies file cases, and first thing which they do is take a warrant, issue a LOC, lookout circular. There's a provision of issuing a lookout circular, and then they apply to Interpol for issuance of a red corner notice. Now, from personal knowledge, from experience, I can say that now even Interpol has become cautious in issuing red corner notices. Earlier, they used to issue red corner notices on a drop of a hat. Now they conduct an inquiry. There's a commission which goes into the validity of the requests. In many cases I have seen, in spite of requests being made by the police, by Delhi police and CBI, sometimes they don't even open red corner notice nowadays. They feel that red corner notice is not something which can be availed of. In every normal case, it has to be a case of some nature. So therefore, they have started examining. So in many cases, I have seen Delhi police has not been able to successfully get a red corner notice.
So cutting short the questions, which I'll again ask in the end, sir, there are a few viewers who wish to, sir, ask some questions. If you may allow, sir, can I directly take them on?
Yes, please.
So this is a question from Himanshu Maheshwari. Sir, he has a question, sir. Sir, up to what extent the extradition court can enter into the disputed question of facts?
Yeah, I've already told you, the extradition court will not go into the facts of the case. It will only, decide within the parameters of the Extradition Act and the Extradition Treaty. Of course, if there is, something like perjury, in case there is a concealment of fact, in case there is an issue with regard to dual criminality, All those issues can be entertained by the court, but disputed questions of fact on merit, the court will not entertain.
So it's basically the prima facie view that the court has to take, sir.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So coming on to the next question, sir. So can a CBI slash enforcement directorate directly send the request to another country to hand over the fugitive? If yes, what is the legality of such a procedure?
No, they can't. They can't. It has to go through Ministry of External Affairs. All correspondence with regard to extradition has to happen through proper channel, diplomatically, through Ministry of External Affairs. Investigating agencies cannot approach the foreign countries directly. It's very clear. There is no doubt about this.
So can the requested state, while allowing an extradition, put a condition to be followed by requesting state? If yes, then what are the legal remedies available to the fugitive, sir, in such conditions? If such conditions are not followed by the requesting state, or may I say so, sir? In other words, sir, the case of Abu Salim, sir, where he's where he's saying the extradition is totally in the case held is totally in contravention to the treaty and request that was put in Portugal court, sir.
Yes, you're right. So there are few judgments which are on doctrine of speciality, where out of exuberance, the investigating agencies, when they feel that they've been waiting for a fugitive for 10-15 years, once he's back, so in exuberance they try to slap more cases. So that is not permissible. There are various judgments. The Honorable Supreme Court has said recently, Delhi High Court also has said that you have to stick to the undertakings. So when the extradition trials happen abroad, the Indian government, the Union of India, has to give undertakings with regard to following the conventions, UN conventions, following the provision of treaty and the act. Those undertakings are given by the secretary, joint secretary level officers. They have to comply with it. So in case there is a non-compliance, there is a provision. Section 21 says the fugitive can be returned back. In fact, when all this happened with regard to Abu Salim, an application was filed, I remember, long time back, where it says that he should be sent back to Portugal because the Indian government is violating the terms and conditions of the order. So absolutely, it is correct. That serious. It is that serious. It has to be taken because these are solemn undertakings between two sovereign nations. So you have to give the credibility to that. So you can't violate it. The moment you violate it, he can be sent back to that country.
So, in other words, sir, that the word given by one sovereign country to another has to be respected in all manners.
Absolutely.
Sir, there is a question from Rohit Santhalia, sir. India does not have any treaty with Canada. A lot of Indian citizens have committed crimes in India and absconded to Canada. What should be the procedure adopted by the Council of Victims in such cases? Yeah. Can we, as lawyers, do something to ensure the Indian government tries to sign an extradition treaty with some countries like Canada, etc., where usually Indian criminals abscond?
I think in case there is no treaty, still extradition can happen. The act is very clear. There are various instances where even retrospectively the treaties have been notified under Section 3 and under Section 18 of the Act. And whether there is extradition treaty or not, if both the countries are interested, as I said earlier also, the fugitive criminals can be returned to the foreign state. So it depends on the willingness of those two sovereign nations. You and I cannot compel the government. It can happen only if both the countries agree. That is why in some cases there is an extradition treaty, in some cases there are arrangements, and in some cases there is none. I remember a case where an accused came back to India. The request, before the extradition request came, that country requested the Indian government and asked that if we send you the request, will you send that person back? Indian government says no, because there is no treaty. You don't send to us, we will not send it to you. So they knew that they will not be able to initiate the extradition process. They asked formally with the government, and the government refused that we are ready if both of us can enter into an agreement. If you're not entering into an agreement, we'll not follow this. So it depends
So
on
it's
both the countries.
so in other words, it's quid pro, sir. In absence of which nothing can be done.
No, actually, it's a mutual cooperation.
So
If you see,
to put
this
it right.
is basically it's a cooperative law enforcement process where
So
two countries willingly, consciously, after entering into an agreement in
I
writing,
agree.
want to do this. Yeah.
Right, sir. So another question from a viewer, sir. What is red corner notice and letter rogatory? How long? How can a consul get the same issued on behalf of his client who is a complainant in the FIR?
Red corner notice and letter rogatories are pertaining to investigation in India, right? As you and I have just discussed, red corner notice is issued when the investigating agency wants a particular person who's abroad, is not joining investigation. So you can issue red corner notice for his return. Letter rogatories is a completely different matter. Letter rogatories are issued under the Criminal Procedure Code. Letter rogatories are under Section 166A, if I'm not wrong, under CRPC, where the investigating agency wants to collect evidence from abroad. Now, suppose there is a Delhi police officer who's conducting investigation with regard to an offense which has partly taken place in Delhi, partly in London. So he needs material from London. He can't simply just take a flight, go to London, and collect the material. This has to go through a diplomatic channel and through the intervention of the court. So letter rogatories are issued by the courts for the assistance of investigating agency to collect material from abroad. So very often we see, when I was standing on to CBI, I noticed, at least at that point of time, 10 years back, that there were many countries, even United States, they never used to bother answering our letter rogatories. The Indian court is writing a letter to US, doesn't get a response. Another request is sent after 6 months, no response. Third request is sent after 6 months, no response. I was shocked when I saw one document where for many years they did not even choose to respond to us.
Oh,
This
wow.
is how the letter rogatories, are entertained or are dealt with by these countries. But
Correct,
nowadays,
sir.
now things have changed. Now, if you see, the letter rogatories are responded. It all depends on your international standing also. Today you are in a much better position, so we get response more quickly and more efficiently.
So, so another question popping in, sir.
Yes.
Is the specialty rule analogous to the rule of double action ability, sir?
Double action is he talking about double jeopardy?
I think so, sir.
No,
It's same,
I
sir.
don't understand. Doctrine
So
of
I'll put it.
doctrine of speciality is section 21 and 31, and also
Correct, sir.
there is a provision in all the treaties. Double jeopardy is something different. Double jeopardy in criminal law is defined in section 300 CRPC, that no person can be
Punished
tried and
twice.
convicted for the same offense, punished for the same offense. Yeah, that's right.
Correct, sir. So another question I think that's popping up, sir. So this is by Himanshu Maheshwari. Up to what extent the extradition court can enter into the disputed question of facts?
This I've already answered. Let's go to the next one.
Absolutely, sir. So question, sir, with regard to the practical aspects, sir. So your practice in India, you're practicing in various forums dealing with the most high-profile cases one can ever think of. And you have also practiced in Dubai, sir, contested cases in Dubai and Greece, sir. Sir, could you tell us the difference between the two, sir? Your as a lawyer that you have appeared before the two, sir, what difference did you find, sir?
Actually, the logic and common sense remains the same everywhere. The
Right, sir.
procedure also is more or less the same. Commonwealth countries have one procedure. There's a civil law procedure which prevails in the other country. But the objective of every procedure is to find the truth and ultimately punish the guilty. The major difference which I have seen in these countries and India is the swiftness with which they can conclude the proceeding. In India, we take a lot of time. because of our procedure. There they use the technology. So when they use the technology, there is a swift justice. There is a the trials are expedited. So major difference which I noticed was not on the procedure, not on the logic of the law, but on the use of technology. Which in fact I always say that in India we should have the same technology where at least we are able to conclude the trials at the earliest. One significant thing which I liked in Greece was that the heinous offenses are tried by three judges, not one. In
Right.
India, even a murder case is tried before one single judge, who may give a good order, who may give a bad order. The judgment may be good, may not be good. But in a case of murder, of course, in a case of death penalty, there's a reference goes to the High Court. But in those countries, there are three judges who conduct a trial which is punishable for more than 5 years. Yes, and so therefore their system is like a pyramid. They give more importance to the lower judiciary. If the lower judiciary, those three judges pass a judgment which is unanimous, then it can't be challenged in the High Court unless and until there is a substantial question of law involved. On facts, it can't be challenged. So see the importance which they are giving to the lower judiciary, the lower system, because the trials happen there. They have all the time to conduct the trial. In our country, it is the other way around. A single judge does the trial of the most heinous offense, and in case there's a death penalty, it goes to the High Court, for approval as a reference. So I still feel that if you have multiple judges handling at least the heinous offenses, the chances of error are minimized.
So, so there's a question from the viewer, sir. So coming on, just extending to the talk that you just example that you gave us, sir, of the courts of Greece and India, sir. So a relevant, pertinent question is coming up, sir, cropping up. We often see the reportable cases in High Court and Supreme Court where the writs are filed, sir. What is the jurisdiction of a magistrate who is inquiring cases for purpose of extradition if the higher courts interfere, sir?
As I spoke earlier, that normally the higher courts don't intervene unless and until there is a constitutional issue involved, or there's a issue with regard to dual criminality, the issue of with regard to applicability of the treaties involved, or the interpretation of treaties involved. Only in those cases I've seen that the higher courts interfere. Otherwise, they don't interfere at all. The original jurisdiction lies with the magistrate, and once the magistrate is hearing the matter, I don't see many higher courts interfering. It's an extreme, in heinous offenses, very difficult to get bail in extradition matters. The courts do not get satisfied that once he's released on bail, he will come back because he's an absconder, he's a fugitive. So courts
Sure.
always, take his undertaking with a pinch of salt.
Correct, sir. So one last question, sir. Sometimes countries put unnecessary conditions while extraditing the fugitive, like extradition only for a particular offense, and they can
Yes.
conduct trial for another offense. How can it be challenged, and what is the legality associated with it?
It can't happen. I will not say deliberately, but yes, since the extradition orders which are passed by various courts abroad are exhaustive orders, all orders are running into hundreds of pages where various constitutional issues are raised by them, the UN conventions are raised by them, and the condition now, condition of jail is one ground which is taken by everybody in England and even in US. So once all this is discussed, there's hardly any scope, for misinterpretation. So these orders are extremely exhaustive to the extent that sometimes the courts even direct that in case the fugitive criminal is detained in custody, he will be detained in which jail, what will be the size of the cell, whether he will be provided with fan or not. So it's an extremely detailed orders which are passed by these courts. The jail conditions, the food, what food are you providing, whether he'll be able to talk to his family or not. So if these kind of directions are passed and undertakings are given by the Indian government, they have to be complied with it. So these are exhaustive orders. Of course, again, you have to make sure that doctrine of speciality is maintained and they are tried only in those offenses in which they have been extradited.
So we won't be surprised if Vijay Malaya or Sir Nirav Modi comes and asks you for a opinion and defend the cases in India, sir, because it's been such a lovely, exhaustive examples that you are throwing, sir. Rather, I was just reading in the newspaper what you said right now, sir, that the size of room, toilets, and all those, these are one of the pleas that Vijay Malaya had taken in London court. So extremely useful one, sir. So before wrapping up the show, sir, one last question, sir. What
Yes.
role do human rights have, sir, in extradition, sir?
They have. Since the courts in United Kingdom and USA give so much of importance to human rights, they make sure that the human rights of the fugitive criminal are intact. They are not violated. He should not be mistreated. Taking that into consideration, only these directions are passed. With regard to
So,
the cell, fan size, etc. So these are UN conventions which we are signatory to and we have to follow. So Indian government doesn't shy away from giving that undertaking to them that they will comply with it. They're more concerned in extraditing and ultimately trying than providing these facilities. These facilities should be provided to everyone. Everyone is presumed innocent till he's
unless found
proven
guilty.
guilty. Proven guilty. So why not provide these facilities in jail to everyone, to all the prisoners? But of course, since those are developed nations and their civil society is very advanced, so they give a lot of prominence to this. That even if you keep somebody in jail, treat them like humans, not inhumans. So the UN conventions on human rights do play a very important role when you're talking about extradition, particularly when they're coming from abroad.
So, coming on to the very last question, sir, you have appeared from prosecution side as well as from defense side, sir. All the high-profile cases of extradition have been dealt by you, sir. Sir, there are countries where torture is a big crime by the state agencies, sir.
Hmm.
And uh, in India, sir, to some extent, where there are allegations that once a person is extradited to India, he faces some or other kind of torture, sir. So, what do you have to say on this, sir?
You're
What is
talking
the
about
remedy available to him, sir?
torture in custody.
Absolutely, sir. For seeking out the confession, sir.
Confession, yeah, you're right. Well, it happens, no doubt about it. Of course, there are some cases which are pending, so it's not appropriate for us to have a discussion on that. But it happens. As I told you earlier, the investigating agencies in exuberance, because they work so hard to get a person extradited. When they seek extradition, then they're ready to give any kind of undertaking. But when extradition actually takes place and they have the custody of the fugitive criminal with them, then probably a feeling might come by saying that now he is with us and we can do whatever we want. That is why those exhaustive orders are passed by the court, giving outline of the framework in which the investigation can go on. And normally in these cases, investigation is concluded. In nine or 10 cases, we see where investigation is concluded, only then the process of extradition starts. So there is no question of custody. You are saying custody. So custody happens very seldom, because the investigation is concluded, that the fugitive criminal is brought and he is sent to Tihar. So he will not be in the custody of the police. There's no question of any torture or something. But in this case, which I mentioned to you recently, it happened that they asked for custody granted, challenge in the High Court. High Court says no, police custody is not permissible. There's a reported judgment of Justice Annu Malhotra, which you can read.
So thank you so much, sir. It's been a very insightful and a knowledgeable, sir, and a profound lecture, sir, from your end, sir. Thank you for sparing us the time, and maybe again request you, sir, to be there another show, sir, with another topic. The viewers are glad, sir, and our team from Legal Saints and Lecture Series on Law is, sir, very grateful to you, sir, for your sparing your valuable time. It's been an insightful lecture, sir, and a very profound one. Thank you so very much, sir,
Thank
for joining
you.
us, sir.
Thank you, Rubinder.
Pleasure, sir, being
I
with you.
also enjoyed the same. And as I said in the beginning, that it's a blessing. Although these are difficult times, we can't go out. We are quarantined at home. Social distancing has to be followed. Courts are off. But this is one blessing for us that at least we can, exchange views. We can talk to our colleagues, students, and youngsters through these webinars. And you are, taking serious pain in this. You have really, really worked very hard and organized some marvelous ones. So I wish you all the best and thanks for calling me. Although it has, I think, dragged for 1 hour 35 minutes. It's too long a session. People will get bored. But
So certainly not, sir.
I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it.
So did we over here, sir, and it's been such a pleasure, sir, and thank you so much, because a stalwart of your stature, sir, coming and addressing us and giving us knowledge, sir, it is really very, very helpful, sir. It boosts our morals up, sir.
Thank you. You have spoken a lot about me, which was not required. Okay, so bias should always be limited. Thank you so much.
But we have to respect our guests, sir. Thank you so very much, sir.
Thank you, my friend.